Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video, and in this video we are going to be continuing our CakePHP 4 tutorial series. And in the last video we were able to access this article page where we could view the different articles that we have. We looked at a controller and how this index method would redirect us, or we would get redirected to the index method if we went into this URL. Now, in this video, we are going to be looking at how we can actually create more articles. So let's just jump right into it and see how it is done. Here I am in my articles controller, and that's where we're going to be working primarily in this video. Now, we want to be able to add articles, but the first thing is that we are going to implement a method, a public, or we're actually going to override a method, the initialize function. The first thing we're going to do is call initialize on the parent so that everything is configured properly. And what you usually do in the initialize method is that you load components that you want to be able to use across the different methods in the class. So for instance, the paginator. If we wanted to use this component in additional methods, we could simply place the load component function up there. Now, as a general rule of thumb or a general convention, I like, personally, I don't know what everyone else does, but I like to actually load the vast majority of my components up here, because then whenever I go into a file, it's very easy for me to figure out where I'm loading all my components and what sort of components I already have available in this particular controller. Now we will need to load an additional component, and that is one called Flash. Now the Flash component is a component that you can use to display what CakePHP calls Flash messages. Ja, sig, jeg kommer lige om... hvordan ser det ud? Jeg kommer lige om 5 minutter. Jeg skal lige... Jeg er lige ved at optage en video, ikke? Og så kommer jeg lige om 5 minutter, ikke?
Optage video?
Ja, vil du gå ned og lige lukke døren? Hvad? Nej, ikke nu. Gå lige ned og lukke døren, så kommer jeg om 5 minutter, ikke? Luk døren, tak. Now, when we load a component in the initialize method, the component is available across all the different functions, and especially the Flash component. That's actually a component you're going to use a lot. So what I recommend doing is actually take it and put it up into the app controller. If you go into the app controller, you can actually see that I have already loaded the Flash component up here in the app controller. It might actually do this by default now, but you can go and you can check it. If you have it here, then it's great, because then all controllers you have will have loaded the Flash component, because if we look here in the articles controller, you can see that we are extending the app controller. And when we call parent initialize, we of course call initialize our parent. Our parent is the app controller, and the initialize function on app controller is right here, and it loads the Flash component. So I recommend having it there, because Flash is, well, to me personally, I use it a lot. It's a very clean and easy way to display messages to the user, as we'll see in a bit. So the next method we will implement is the add method. It's again a public function, and we will call it add. The first thing we do in the add method is that we create a new article. The way we do this is that we simply call this, and then we say articles, the name of this controller, and then we call new empty entity. Now what actually happens here is that it uses the table method. It's accessed via something called, it's a magic method. You can read more about that if you want to, but basically we create a new empty entity from the articles table. So this article variable will now be an empty article entity. Now entity is just what CakePHP calls, how to put it, it's a an object representing a row in the database, right? So this is just an article. If you were working in other programming languages, it's just like creating a new empty object from the articles table that has the article table's structure as its, or the columns as its instance variables. That's the gist of it. They just call it entities. So now by doing this, we essentially just have an empty article entity. In order to populate this entity, we need to first check if this is actually a post method, because if this is just a regular request, it's not a post method, we can't really create an article because we need some sort of data, usually supplied in a form field. So first we will call this request is post. We are simply asking if this request is of type post. A really convenient way to check. If it is, we will simply populate this particular new empty entity we created here by saying this articles patch entity. Now, patching an entity is simply just filling out all the data fields or all the instance variables in the particular entity. Now, what's really smart here is that we can actually patch it by saying this request get data. Oh, sorry, first we need to supply something here first. We need to first say which entity are you patching. That's the first argument into this method. We are patching the article and entity that we created right here. And what are we patching it with? We are patching it with the request get data method. This particular line, you can take it and you can place it inside a debug. If you want to check it out, I really recommend this. If you do this, you debug it, you can see the structure of it and what's actually in that array. But essentially, it is just everything in your request. If you submit some form data using different input fields, everything will be in this request get data. And if you name those fields right in the view or in the add view file, as you'll see in a bit, it will patch this entity automatically. Really powerful. The next thing is that we will have to hard code the user ID like this. So this is also showing how you can actually go in and manually change some fields. And we have a user ID in the database of articles. So they have this user ID, but right now we haven't implemented the authentication layer yet. So we don't really have the user ID of the user that's logged in right now. So right now we'll just set it to 1 just to have it work, because the user ID is a not null column, so we need some sort of data in here. The next thing is that we will check if we can actually save this. So right now we have an article, we created a new entity, we patched it up, filled it up with the data that we needed, and then we need to save it into the database. And the way we do this is, again, we call this articles in order to talk to the articles table, you can actually say. You can almost think of it as you're calling methods on the articles table in your database. It's not really that, but it's pretty close. And you want to save this particular entity. So of course, it's just a method called save that as a single argument will take an entity, and we will pass in the articles entity that we just created above. This will return a Boolean, and if that's true, it means it was able to save successfully. And if it isn't, you can include an else statement and you can do some error handling, but we'll actually be doing it a different way. So if it is successfully saved, we want to display a message to the user, and we can do that by saying this flash, because we loaded the flash components, and we can call the success method, which will display a message in a very cheerful or like successful color scheme. And we will simply say your article has been saved. and we'll give them like a small little winky face to go with it. It's small winky faces here and there in your application always. They help to brighten the user's day. So after that, we will simply return and call this redirect. Then we will redirect to an action called index. So we are redirecting to a particular place, and we're doing it on the same controller to the action called index. So we're essentially calling this method and redirecting the user to that part. So whenever you create a new article, you get redirected to the page showing all articles. If this doesn't happen, then we can actually display an error message. We can say couldn't save, because if we get to this part, that means we didn't go inside this if statement, so we didn't get to the return statement, and the program will continue execution. So if we get here, we know that something failed in the save method, and for some reason we couldn't save. So again, we call the flash component, and we call the error message, and we can simply say unable to save article, and then we can make a sad face because now everyone is having a bad day. If it is not a post method, now we're just we're out of this block. Everything in here is only if we're dealing with a post request. But if it is not a post request, we will simply call a method called set. And remember, set, we saw that in the index method. That's the way we can pass data from a controller to a view file. And we will call this article, and we will actually pass the empty entity into the view file. Now note, this will only get executed if we're just going into the add URL with a get request. It's not a post, because then you will execute this line of code, you'll create the entity, it'll check if it's, is it a post request, and if it isn't, then we will set the variable here and we'll pass the empty entity out to the view. And you will see exactly why we're doing that right now, because now we will create the view file. Whoops, I already think we have, yeah, there we go. We have the articles folder inside the templates folder right here where we have the index view implemented. So now we will implement the add method. There we go. We can remove this. So now we are in the add method. This view will get called whenever we go into our application /articles/add. Then we'll go in here. So at first, let's just put a message saying add article. We'll save this and we'll go back into the browser here. And let's just try and go into, I don't think you can see that. Let me just, there we go. I think this might be better. There we go. If we go into articles/add, we should get redirected to that page. There we go. So we know everything is working as it should be. Go back into PHP Storm, and we will now write some PHP code. Whoops. There we go. Remember that we passed in the empty entity, the new article. So what we're going to do is that we will echo out, and then we will say this form. So we're calling something called the form helper, and we will call the create method on the form helper. This is essentially just creating like the beginning form tag. You do that in HTML, where you would say form, method, post, and all that. This method is essentially doing the same thing. But what is important is that in here, as an argument, we pass in the empty entity, because now CakePHP will actually know that we're creating a form, and inside this form, we want to populate this empty article so it knows what our intentions are, and that's going to be very important, as you'll see in a bit. The next thing is that I will now echo out the end, because every opening tag needs a closing tag. So again, as if you were doing it In HTML, you would do the same thing. You would close off your form, and we do the same thing by calling the end method on the form helper. Everything we place in between here should be the form fields, the input fields. And again, we echo them out. We call this form, and we call control. And control is just like a master method for adding different form controls. And as the first argument, we will say user ID. The first part in this control method should be named after the column of the table that we are working with. So for our articles table, we have a column called user ID. And if we want a form control where we can set the user ID, we will put it in here. But other than that, you can include as a second parameter, you can include an options array where you can specify a lot of different options. I mean, if there's anything you want to change, you probably do it in the options array. And it's a key value pair. So for instance, we can say that we want the type to be hidden like this. Again, a key value pair, what type of property are you changing and what should the value of that property be, or that option. And we will set the value here to be 1. So we just hard code this in because again, we don't have access to the logged in user just yet. The next control we will create, again, we're using the same method on the form helper, and that's simply going to be called the title. And if you go and look in the articles table, there is a column called title. So this particular control field will be the one containing the data to put into the title column of this particular article. And what's really great is that the form helper here, the control method, will look at what type of data type this particular column has, and it will create the appropriate control field or input field for that, which is just amazing. And it's also that, this naming convention that will enable us to patch the entity without doing anything because it knows where the title should go. So it's really important everything is named this way. Again, let's just create a new form field here. I'm going to put in a control field for the body. And we will actually be needing a options array here where we can specify how many rows to have, because that's a text area. We'll have 3 rows. And then we'll echo out a button. That's the only one that's different because we want something to save the article with. So we have 3 control fields and we have a button. Let's just save this and see how it looks in the browser. Okay, so we have an undefined variable called articles on line 5. So it can't find this, and that's because I named it wrong, because let's go into the articles controller here. You can see down here on line 42 where I set this variable and I pass it on to the view. I call it article, I don't call it articles. So I go out here and I just have to change it to article. This is the only downside of PHP in general, is that you don't have this tight coupling. In here we don't know the particular name. It can't auto-complete it for us. We need to spell it out manually. But luckily it's pretty obvious what the error usually is. So refresh that and you can see here we have a nice, decent page in a clean layout, great for testing. And we can put in a title, blah, 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 and we can put in a body, and it has 3 rows of data, and we can call the save article. If we do this, we will probably get an error. And you know what? We can actually just, let's just try and do it. Let's just call this my test article, some test body content. And let's call the save article. And we get a database error. And that's because the field slug doesn't have a default value. Let's go into the actual database and go into the CMS database and into our articles. There we go. we can see the slug here is a column that we haven't done anything with. We have manually set the user ID. We have a control field for the title. We have nothing for the slug, which it needs something because it doesn't have a default value. We have a control field for the body, and this one has a default value of 0, whether it's published or not, and the created and modified are set automatically. So essentially here is just saying that, I can't create this article because the slug doesn't have a default value. So let's fix that. And the easiest way, or maybe not the easiest, but it's, a way of showing off a little bit more of the CakePHP magic. We can go into the model table, and then we go into the articles table. There we go. So in here, we can do behavior that we want to be across the entire articles table, not just on entity level. What we are gonna override here is a function called beforesave. Yeah. Now the beforesave method will take in an event interface. There we go. There we go. We'll call it events. We'll take in an entity, and it'll take in a options. Now you can also just Google this. If you Google like CakePHP beforesave, then you will get the description for this particular method, and you can just implement that. And in here, we can do some work before a new entity is saved to the database. So whenever we try to save an entity, it'll go into this method, and we can do some work if we want to do that. For instance, we can go and create a slug for this particular article. And we are passing in the entity here. This is the entity being created right now. And we can ask if the entity is new. And you know what? We can probably just up here, if we say, to make it a little cleaner, use cake. Where's this one? Use cake, utility, and text. And we can say use cake event and event interface, because then we can remove this part right there. Might be a little cleaner. That's up to you, what you like the best. We'll use the text, the utility text later. Here we ask if the entity is new, and if the entity does not have a slug. In that case, it's a new entity, it doesn't have a slug set to it. We will create a slugged title. And the way we can do that is we can use the text utility, and we can call a static method on it called slug, which will create a slug for us, and we will create it from the title of the entity. So we'll create a URL friendly slug from the title of the entity. And again, if you want to see any of this in action, like you can try and debug it out, you can debug the slug title like before and after, you can take the title and you can see what the slug method is doing. All that you should be comfortable with PHP in order to do your own debugging and your own digging if you want to know all these things. We will also just trim the slug down here, let's just make it space, there we go. And we will simply say article slug will be equal a substring of the slug title 0 and 19, so that we don't go beyond the maximum length that we have defined in our database. So here we will set a slug on the entity. Let's just try and see if it works before we dig any deeper. Here we can actually just refresh this page and we will send the formula again with the same data, and that did not work. Let's try again. Test article, and let's just write some bollocks in here. There we go. No, it still fails. So let's see why we are probably not being redirected into this table. And whenever you want to check, it's actually a great way to show you how to debug in Cake. Usually you want to figure out if you're actually going the right places. So here you can put a die statement and say hello, whatever, just to see if we're actually getting into this method. And as expected, we are not. So there is something wrong with the implementation of the beforesave method. We are not going in here as we should.
Og ser du ikke mere nu?
Jo, jeg er ikke færdig. Jeg skal nok komme ned. Ja.
Nå, hvad laver du? Jeg troede, du så pressemøde.
Nej. model table articles Okay, so after a little digging, I actually figured out what the problem was. It took me a while because I totally missed it. Up here, you need to specify the namespace you are working in. And the namespace of this one is the app / model / table. If you don't put this, it doesn't, for some reason, it doesn't work in the beforesave method. So you need to make sure that you at the top of every single table class that you make, you need to specify the namespace. Because then if we again try to create a new article, we can see that we get the hello statement printed out, so we know we are now in the beforesave method. And let's just create a proper article. Test title, my new body, save this article, and we can now see the article has been saved. We go into the articles database, browse it up, and here we have the test title we made, and we can see a test or a slug has been made by slugifying the title of this particular article. So now we know that it's working as well. So great, now we can actually create articles. That's just awesome. One small thing is that we might want to actually have a button in here to create articles, because users, they don't go up into your URL and do work, so they need links on your site. And we want to create a link in here in the articles index method, so we go into the index view down here, and we will place a add article link before the table, so right up here in the top. And we will simply just call this HTML link. We will call it add article, and where will it go? It will call an action on the same controller called add. There we go. We save that up and we go into this page again, and right now we have a link here called add article. If we click on that, we go in here and we can say, we can create another article. We call it earthquake in Guamba. Don't even know if that's a thing. Something spewed out of a mountain. There we go. That's a great article. We save that one, and we have the earthquake in Guamba article down here. And we can also go in here, and we can see that it is creating a slugified version of the title. And actually, there we saw the trimming in effect, because it says earthquake in Guam. It has actually truncated the last letter there. So this is actually going to be where we stop this video. We did cover a lot of ground. We saw how we can create a brand new entity, and right now I'll just quickly recap once we have all the moving pieces in play. So first up, articles controller, the add method. We create a new empty entity and we pass that on to the view. Ignore this because now we're not talking about the post method. We go into the add view down here. We can now create a form by passing in the empty entity. We will then create controls, and the first variable will be the name of the column that we are setting data on. We will then close off the form, of course have a button right here, and if we don't pass any other information, it will assume we want a post request to the same URL. And that's exactly what we want. So we press the button, we go in here again in the add method. I know we create a new empty entity anyways, and then we go into the post method, then we fill up the empty entity, we patch it up with data from the request, and it knows where to put everything because we named everything the proper way, where we manually set the user ID. Not even sure we have to do this because we actually have a control field for it, so I think you could actually leave that one out because we have the user ID right here set. So I think you could actually leave that out. Anyways, it shows you how you can manually go into adding fields if you have some fields that you want to manually alter. We save it up and we display a flash message. And before we save, we have implemented this beforesave method where we create a slug title. Now this has, it isn't complete because we don't really think about duplicate slugs or anything like that, but we will fix that later. But we have a basic working example of how you can add articles to your database. In the next video, we will be implementing a edit action. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.